Winter 1942. The Volga runs black with smoke, its waters carrying the wreckage of a city under siege. Stalingrad, once an industrial giant, has become a crucible of annihilation, where two empires bleed for dominance. History remembers this as the turning point, the place where Hitler's dream began to unravel. But what if it hadn't? What if the jaws of defeat had opened differently, sparing the German Sixth Army, silencing Soviet triumph, and reshaping the fate of a world already trembling at the edge of collapse? This is the history that was almost written. The winter of 1942 on the Eastern Front was remembered by survivors as a season of steel and desperation. Stalingrad had already been burning for months, its ruins soaked with blood, its factories reduced to rubble, its streets fought for meter by meter. In the historical record, the German Sixth Army was encircled and slowly strangled by Soviet pincers. But in the sealed files of the German High Command, one can trace a shadow path, a sequence of decisions and maneuvers that, had they unfolded just slightly differently, might have torn history itself off its rails. This path begins with Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm, the relief effort mounted under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. In December 1942, Hitler's armies were stretched thin, bleeding from attrition and winter's grip. Manstein, commanding Army Group Don, launched his counter-offensive from Kotelnikovo with the 4th Panzer Army, spearheaded by General Hoth's panzers. Historically, his drive stalled short of the encircled Paulus. But here, in this alternative record, we follow a different course. Intelligence failures within the Soviet command, coupled with overstretched logistics on the Don front, leave a temporary weakness along the defensive belts south of Stalingrad. Hoth's tanks exploit the gap. The 6th Panzer Division, recently transferred from France, smashes forward with the ferocity of an armored blade. Soviet anti-tank defenses, hastily repositioned, are outflanked by German mobile tactics. Bitter cold and swirling snow blind Soviet artillery, reducing the effectiveness of the defensive fire. Slowly, inexorably, the armored columns close the distance. Paulus, inside the Kessel, had begged for orders. In reality, Hitler forbade him to break out, demanding that he hold Stalingrad to the last man. But in this unfolding counterfactual, Manstein convinces Hitler, through carefully couched language, that allowing a breakout is essential for the honor of the Wehrmacht. The Führer, reluctant but swayed by the prestige of his new field marshal, grudgingly authorizes Paulus to attempt a tactical withdrawal to reinforce the relief force. For the first time in weeks, Paulus's starving divisions move with purpose. Columns of weary, frostbitten soldiers, dragging field guns and limping horses push westward against Soviet containment lines. German coordination, though chaotic, is desperate enough to succeed. On December 23rd, battered elements of 6th Army link with spearheads of Hoth's panzers near Verkhnechumsky. Against all odds, a narrow corridor is forced open. The breakout does not save everyone. Tens of thousands of German wounded and stragglers are left behind in the ruins of Stalingrad, falling into Soviet hands. But an estimated 120,000 men, remnants of once proud divisions, managed to retreat westward, abandoning the city. Operation Winter Storm has succeeded, not as a triumph, but as a bloody rescue from certain annihilation. For the German High Command, this is salvation. For Stalin and the Stavka, it is humiliation. The immediate consequences ripple across the Eastern Front. The Soviet plan, Operation Saturn, designed to expand the encirclement and crush German Army Group A in the Caucasus, falters. Instead of cutting into Rostov and sealing off the retreat, Soviet spearheads encounter reinforced German formations bolstered by survivors from Paulus's command. The Red Army offensive stalls amid heavy casualties. Though the Soviets retain the upper hand in manpower and resources, their aura of unstoppable momentum is shattered. German propaganda seizes upon the narrative. The 6th Army lives. Goebbels orders newsreels showing emaciated but defiant soldiers rejoining their comrades, framed as a miracle of German endurance. Politically, the impact is profound. In Berlin, Hitler interprets the rescue as validation of his leadership. He boasts that his iron will, not the pessimism of generals, preserved Germany from disaster. Among the Allies, the news is unsettling. British intelligence assessments note with alarm that the Wehrmacht remains a formidable adversary, its morale unbroken. Roosevelt, already weighing the slow build-up for Operation Overlord, hears reports from his generals that the Eastern Front may not collapse as anticipated. Allied propaganda continues to emphasize German weakness, but privately, doubts fester. For the Soviet Union, the psychological wound runs deeper. Stalin, enraged by the escape, executes several commanders accused of gross negligence in the face of the enemy. NKVD files later declassified describe panic in Moscow, where whispers circulated that Stalin himself had nearly fled during the darkest days of the war. Soviet troops, once certain that Stalingrad marked the turning tide, now face a grim realization. The Germans can still strike back with deadly force. Red Army planners adjust their strategies, becoming more cautious, more deliberate. The dream of a quick march westward evaporates into the brutal reality of a prolonged struggle. The long-term ripple effects stretch across the war's trajectory. Without the total annihilation of Sixth Army, Germany retains greater manpower, reserves for 1943. In the summer, when Operation Citadel, the Kursk offensive, is launched, German divisions are marginally stronger, infused with veterans from Stalingrad who would otherwise have perished. Though Kursk still bleeds the Wehrmacht heavily, the balance tilts just enough to prolong the campaign. The war drags into stalemates across the steppe, with Soviet advances slowed, German defenses hardened. Each month of delay buys Berlin precious time. This delay reshapes the global calculus. In the West, Allied planners reconsider the timetable for opening a second front in France. Some voices argue that if Germany holds longer in the East, a Balkan invasion route should be prioritized. Churchill, ever the advocate of striking Europe's soft underbelly, gains renewed traction for operations in Greece and Yugoslavia. The Anglo-American alliance, strained by diverging priorities, begins to show cracks. Stalin, frustrated by the West's hesitancy, grows more suspicious of his allies. His trust, never abundant, erodes further, sowing seeds of the Cold War even before the war itself is over. As the war grinds on, the survival of Sixth Army alters post-war geopolitics. With Soviet advances slower, the Red Army reaches Central Europe later than in our timeline. When the Allies finally launch their invasion of Normandy, German defenses are slightly weaker in the West, but the Eastern Front remains dangerously alive. The result is a Europe divided differently at war's end. Soviet influence perhaps not extending as far west as historically, leaving countries like Austria or even parts of Czechoslovakia under Western sway. The Cold War's Iron Curtain, though still descending, may fall further east. Yet the survival of Sixth Army carries a darker legacy for Germany as well. Soldiers who escape the encirclement return haunted, embittered, and scarred by starvation and frostbite. Their testimonies, suppressed in the Reich's propaganda machine, nonetheless circulate quietly among the ranks. Stories of betrayal, of being abandoned, of comrades frozen in the Volga's wasteland. These whispers gnaw at the Wehrmacht's spirit, feeding resentment toward Hitler's reckless command. While their survival boosts the Reich in the short term, it plants seeds of dissent within the officer corps, seeds that will later feed plots against the Führer. The alternate Stalingrad, then, is not a German victory in the conventional sense. The city itself is abandoned, left a heap of ruins under Soviet control. But in this version of history, the annihilation never occurs. The legend of Stalingrad as the turning point of the war is blunted. Instead, it becomes a bloody stalemate, a German escape that prolongs the agony of Europe. The war stretches on longer, deadlier, and more uncertain, reshaping the contours of the post-war world. In the classified margins of history, Operation Winter Storm's success is remembered not as triumph or defeat, but as the war's cruel reprieve, a moment when the jaws of disaster opened, only to snap shut again years later in Berlin's ruins. In the brutal winter of 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad was more than a clash of armies. It was a contest for supply, endurance, and the will to resist. The city itself was not the only battlefield. Just east of Stalingrad, across the icy waters of the Volga, ran the fragile lifeline that kept the Soviet 62nd Army alive. Barges, ferries, and makeshift rafts shuttled men, ammunition, and bread across the river under the cover of darkness, slipping through the bombs and fire. In reality, these crossings, though perilous, were never entirely severed. But in the sealed archives of Luftwaffe operations lies a chilling counterfactual. A scenario in which German air power achieved what it promised, but never quite delivered. In this shadowed version of events, the Volga crossing is sealed, and the fate of Stalingrad, and perhaps the entire war, tilts in another direction. By late autumn, the Luftwaffe was stretched thin. Its once feared squadrons were depleted, engines frozen, fuel scarce. The effort to supply Paulus's encircled army from the air became an impossible burden. But in this alternative history, Göring's air fleets do not waste their strength on the doomed gamble of aerial resupply. Instead, they concentrate their remaining resources on a single, ruthless mission: complete interdiction of the Volga. Junkers, 87, Stukas and Heinkel, 111 bombers, fly relentless sorties against Soviet ferry points, while Messerschmitt 109's strafe the icy river crossings. Soviet attempts to reinforce across the water are shredded in daylight raids. By mid-November, the Great River, Stalin's artery to the front, becomes a graveyard of splintered barges and sunken pontoons. Eyewitnesses describe the horror. Soviet infantry units, ordered to cross in small boats, find themselves trapped midstream as Luftwaffe cannons rake the waters. Survivors stagger onto the western bank, only to discover shattered supply dumps, the air thick with fire and dust. Entire regiments of reinforcements perish before even reaching the front line. Chuikov, commanding the 62nd Army inside Stalingrad, sends frantic messages to Moscow. The Volga is death. We are being bled dry. His men fight on, but ammunition dwindles to handfuls of cartridges per soldier. Rations shrink to scraps. The morale that once anchored Soviet resistance in the ruins begins to fray. As the Luftwaffe establishes dominance, the defenders' cohesion unravels. The 62nd Army, famous in our reality for its stubborn stand in the rubble of the tractor factory and the Red October steelworks, is slowly strangled. German stormtroopers push forward, no longer met with fresh Soviet waves replenished nightly from across the river. By December, German units occupy most of the western bank. Chuikov, cornered and isolated, orders desperate counterattacks, but his forces disintegrate into small, starving bands. Soviet soldiers surrender in groups, their rifles empty, their faces hollow. By New Year's Day, the battle for Stalingrad is over. Not as a triumph of Soviet endurance, but as a massacre. The German 6th Army, still battered but intact, raises the swastika over the ruins. The Volga crossing is sealed, and with it, the Soviet dream of defiance at Stalingrad. The immediate consequences ripple outward with brutal clarity. The Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, which historically encircled Paulus, cannot unfold as planned. Without the reinforcement of Chuikov's army from across the Volga, the pincers close weaker and slower. The northern thrust near Serafimovich still drives forward, but the southern jaw stalls, unable to breach German lines reinforced by men freed from the ruins of Stalingrad. The encirclement never fully forms. The 6th Army, instead of being trapped, survives to fight another day. Soviet casualties, already staggering, climb into the unimaginable as divisions bleed themselves dry against the fortified German positions. For the Germans, this is more than survival. It is vindication. Stalingrad becomes a symbol of victory, not catastrophe. Hitler, buoyed by the news, declares that the Reich has crushed the Soviet heart along the Volga. Goebbels unleashes a propaganda storm. The river has been cut, the Bolshevik beast severed from its lifeblood. Across occupied Europe, collaborationist governments take renewed confidence in Germany's invincibility. In Berlin, the Reichstag resounds with applause for Paulus and his men, now celebrated as victors rather than martyrs. For Stalin, the consequences are dire. His political gamble, that the Red Army could hold Stalingrad at any cost, has failed catastrophically. In the Politburo, whispers of dissent grow louder. NKVD interrogations record panic among civilians in Moscow, who hear rumors that Stalin may be preparing to relocate eastward. The Red Army, stunned by defeat, reels backward into defensive postures along the Don. Plans for bold offensives are shelved. Instead of riding the momentum of victory into 1943, the Soviets face the sobering reality of a war slipping from their grasp. The Western Allies, too, are shaken. In London, Churchill receives the news with grim silence. Reports from Moscow, heavily censored but still bleak, paint a picture of Soviet armies on the verge of collapse. In Washington, Roosevelt's advisors warn that the Eastern Front may not hold another year. Suddenly, the prospect of Germany transferring divisions westward becomes all too real. The timetable for Operation Overlord is thrown into doubt. Some voices suggest that the Allies should reconsider their reliance on the Soviet Union as the primary battering ram against Hitler. Strategic debates intensify over whether to shift resources to the Mediterranean or accelerate nuclear research, fearing that without the Soviets, the war in Europe may grind into stalemate. The long-term ripple effects are profound. With the Soviets reeling, German forces stabilize the Caucasus front, maintaining access to vital oil resources. The Wehrmacht, though exhausted, retains enough strength to mount fresh offensives in 1943, buying the Reich time it never had in reality. The Red Army, robbed of the morale surge that followed the historical Stalingrad victory, becomes more cautious, less willing to risk bold encirclements. Each Soviet advance meets stiffer German resistance, the war dragging on in a grueling war of attrition. In the post-war imagination, the absence of Stalingrad as a turning point changes everything. Instead of being hailed as the graveyard of German ambition, it becomes the grave of Soviet defiance. The mythology of Soviet invincibility never takes root. Propaganda films that once celebrated the city's ruins as symbols of resilience are never made. Instead, silence hangs over the Volga, a silence heavy with defeat. Western diplomats, negotiating the shape of post-war Europe, find a weaker Soviet Union at the table, its influence diminished, its territory reclaimed at greater cost and slower pace. The Iron Curtain, if it falls at all, may hang further east, leaving Eastern Europe less firmly under Moscow's grasp. For the men who fought and died there, the sealing of the Volga becomes a symbol not of triumph or tragedy, but of annihilation. In memoirs smuggled from the archives, Soviet survivors speak of the river of death, of watching comrades vanish beneath the icy waters, of feeling abandoned by their own command. For the Germans too, the victory carries a bitter aftertaste. The city they capture is a corpse, its factories ruined, its civilian population starved or fled. They hold a wasteland, not a prize, but the propaganda machine spins it into a jewel of conquest. Thus, in this suppressed version of history, Stalingrad does not mark the rebirth of Soviet strength, but the beginning of Soviet retreat. The sealing of the Volga is remembered in whispers as the day the tide refused to turn, the day when the outcome of the Second World War teetered on the edge of another, darker possibility. The spectre of defeat at Stalingrad carried consequences far beyond the Volga. In this alternate history, where Paulus's Sixth Army survives and the Soviet defense collapses, the psychological shock reverberates through the Kremlin itself. The winter of 1942-43 becomes not the moment of Soviet resurgence, but the moment of near disintegration. In the hidden transcripts of Stavka meetings, suppressed for decades and only hinted at in declassified cables, lies a startling contingency. The planned evacuation of Moscow, known internally under the codename Operation Red Reserve, This blueprint for retreat was drawn up in secrecy by the NKVD and the General Staff. In the real timeline, it was never carried out. But in this darker narrative, Stalin himself contemplates abandoning the capital. The chain of events begins in the weeks after the German capture of Stalingrad. The Red Army, denied its great symbolic victory, falters. Operation Uranus, the counteroffensive meant to encircle German forces, fails to achieve decisive results. Soviet losses mount catastrophically. German panzers, freed from the meat grinder of the Volga, reposition toward the Don Bassin and strike anew. The southern front bends under the pressure. Rostov, gateway to the Caucasus, falls again. Intelligence suggests the Germans might soon drive northeast in a renewed attempt to encircle Moscow. Panic creeps into Stavka reports, couched in the language of strategic withdrawals and elastic defense. Stalin, known for his iron refusal to abandon ground, finds himself staring at a map where every arrow points toward disaster. In Moscow, signs of fear multiply. Civilians recall that the government had already prepared once, in October 1941, to abandon the city when Guderian's tanks closed in. Back then, Stalin stayed, his presence galvanizing morale. But now, in early 1943, the situation is different. The army has failed at Stalingrad. The myth of Soviet invincibility is broken. Trains are quietly assembled at Yaroslavsky Station, their carriages marked not for passengers, but for archives, gold reserves, and government staff. NKVD guards secure the platforms. Orders circulate under strict secrecy. The Politburo is to be ready to depart eastward at a moment's notice, to Kuibyshev or beyond the Urals, should German advances threaten the capital. For the ordinary Muscovite, rumors spread like fire. The Kremlin is leaving. Stalin is leaving. Stalin himself agonizes over the decision. NKVD notes of closed sessions describe him pacing, chain-smoking, his silence stretching for hours as generals present maps and casualty charts. Zhukov, ever the pragmatist, insists the Red Army can hold the defensive belts around Moscow. But others, like Vasilevsky and Voroshilov, whisper of conserving the state apparatus by withdrawing it eastward. For Stalin, the dilemma is existential. Abandon Moscow and preserve the regime, or risk annihilation by clinging to it. In this alternate thread of history, he chooses pragmatism. The order is signed. Operation Red Reserve begins in January 1943. The evacuation is carried out under cover of darkness. Train convoys depart one by one, their windows blacked out, guarded by NKVD detachments. Government ministries, foreign embassies, and the Comintern headquarters are relocated eastward. Stalin does not travel in the first wave, but his family and close aides are quietly removed. The Soviet capital, for the first time, is left hollow, its symbolic power undermined. Foreign observers in Moscow, particularly the British and American diplomats, report the exodus with alarm. Their cables to London and Washington speak of Soviet government in flight, a sign, they fear, that the USSR is on the brink of collapse. The short-term consequences are immediate. German propaganda seizes on the evacuation. Leaflets dropped over Soviet lines proclaim, "Moscow is abandoned, Stalin has fled." Goebbels declares over the radio that Bolshevism is dying, its leaders running from the might of the Reich. The morale of Soviet soldiers, already battered by the Stalingrad defeat, plunges. Desertions spike. Some units surrender en masse, convinced the government no longer stands behind them. The Wehrmacht, though still overstretched, capitalizes on the psychological blow. Army Group Center, reinforced by veterans of the Southern campaign, pushes forward into Orel and Bryansk, tightening the noose around the Central Soviet front. Internationally, the evacuation shakes Allied confidence. Churchill, upon receiving intelligence reports, remarks privately that the Russian bear may yet fall. Roosevelt's advisors, cautious of pouring resources into a collapsing ally, urge a re-evaluation of Lend-Lease priorities. The Western allies had counted on the Soviets to bear the brunt of the German war machine. Now, with Moscow evacuated, they fear the Eastern Front may crack wide open. strategic debates intensify. Should the Allies accelerate plans for an invasion of France to relieve pressure? Or should they prepare for the possibility of negotiating with a Europe dominated by Hitler? Long-term ripple effects stretch across the war and beyond. Without Moscow as the enduring symbol of Soviet resistance, the Red Army loses its psychological anchor. The Soviet advance westward, already slowed by the failure at Stalingrad, falters further. The Germans consolidate their positions in Ukraine and the Caucasus, holding vital resources longer than in our reality. The Eastern Front becomes a grinding war of attrition without decisive Soviet breakthroughs. The Western Allies, pressured to act, consider opening a Balkan front earlier, reshaping the trajectory of the war in Europe. Stalin, now ruling from Kuibyshev, grows more paranoid and distrustful of his allies, convinced they are waiting for the Soviet Union to collapse before intervening decisively. The post-war world, too, is reshaped. With the Soviet Union weakened, by retreat and humiliation, its bargaining power at Yalta, or its equivalent, diminishes. Eastern Europe, historically absorbed into the Soviet sphere, remains contested. Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia may fall under Western influence rather than Moscow's control. The Iron Curtain, if it descends at all, may run along the Soviet border itself. The Cold War, born of mistrust, still comes, but with a diminished Soviet Union facing a far stronger Western bloc. For the Russian people, the memory of this evacuation becomes a scar. Folk songs and whispers speak of the night the Kremlin left us, a betrayal felt for generations. Veterans recall not only the hunger and death at the front, but the moment when the government itself seemed to abandon them. In the official Soviet narrative, these events are later erased, rewritten to preserve the myth of unbroken resolve. But in the buried archives, the truth remains. A moment in history when the Kremlin's heart faltered, when the Soviet Union teetered on the edge of collapse, and when the future of Europe hung on the decision of one man to stay or to flee. Thus, in this alternate account, the Kremlin's evacuation becomes more than a tactical maneuver. It is a symbol of fragility, of a regime that survived not through defiance at Moscow, but through retreat and endurance in exile. The war continues, but the image of Soviet strength, so vital to the mythology of victory, is shattered forever, and in its place lingers a chilling thought that the world we know was only one possibility, born not of inevitability, but of choices made in the coldest winter of the war. The battlefields of Stalingrad did not exist in isolation. From Washington to London, the outcome of the Eastern Front shaped every calculation of Allied strategy. In the official histories, the Soviet victory in early 1943 inspired confidence, emboldening Allied leaders to commit to Operation Overlord and the long-promised invasion of France. But in this alternate history, where the Germans seize Stalingrad and Paulus's Sixth Army emerges bloodied but unbroken, the ripple effects reach the highest councils of war. The Allied grand strategy shifts, not in triumph, but in hesitation, as Western leaders grapple with the possibility of a Europe where the Soviet Union may not endure. The first shockwave strikes in January 1943, as reports from Moscow confirm the fall of Stalingrad. Roosevelt, briefed by Marshall and King, hears grim assessments. The Red Army has been mauled, its reserves exhausted, its morale shaken. Churchill, reading ultra-decrypts that paint a similar picture, concludes privately that the Russians are staggering. In Casablanca, where Allied leaders had gathered to coordinate their next moves, the tone of discussion shifts dramatically. Historically, the conference produced a firm commitment to unconditional surrender and plans for a cross-channel invasion in 1944. But in this shadowed version, the fall of Stalingrad forces a different agenda. The British argue forcefully that the Balkans must become the priority, a strategy to chip away at Germany's soft underbelly, while minimizing reliance on a collapsing Soviet front. The Americans, though initially resistant, cannot ignore the mounting evidence that Stalin may not hold the line. The consequences ripple outward through the machinery of war. Lend-lease shipments, once envisioned as a flood of supplies sustaining. The Red Army, slow as Washington grows uncertain about investing in a potential lost cause. Soviet requests for more trucks, more aircraft, and more food are met with delays and excuses. Stalin, receiving the news in his relocated headquarters east of Moscow, interprets this not as pragmatism, but betrayal. His letters to Roosevelt grow colder, his trust in Allied promises eroding with every delayed convoy. The tenuous partnership of the Grand Alliance begins to fracture at the very moment it is needed most. In military terms, the delay of Operation Overlord becomes the defining consequence. Without confidence that the Soviets can tie down the bulk of the Wehrmacht, the Americans postpone the cross-channel invasion indefinitely. The build-up in Britain continues, but instead of D-Day in 1944, attention turns southward. Operations in the Mediterranean expand. Sicily still falls, Italy is invaded, but Allied troops dig deeper into the Balkans. Greece, Yugoslavia, and perhaps even Bulgaria become targets of opportunity. The war in the West shifts from the beaches of Normandy to the rugged mountains of southeastern Europe, a slower, bloodier advance into the heart of the Reich. Germany, though pressured on multiple fronts, avoids the decisive blow that Normandy delivered in our history. The Germans, for their part, seize the breathing space. With Sixth Army preserved, with Stalingrad secured, Hitler declares the Reich invincible. Army Group South consolidates its grip on the Caucasus, securing oil fields that extend the Wehrmacht's ability to fight. Army Group Center stabilizes, its front lines absorbing reinforcements freed from the south. When the Allies delay their cross-channel strike, Germany capitalizes by redeploying divisions westward. Atlantic Wall fortifications strengthen. By 1945, any Allied invasion across the Channel would face a more formidable, better prepared defense than the one encountered historically in June 1944. The long-term consequences are profound. The war drags into a prolonged stalemate, with Soviet forces clinging desperately to territory east of the Dnieper, while Allied troops slog northward from the Mediterranean. Casualties soar. Political will in Britain begins to fracture under the weight of endless campaigns in Italy and Greece. In the United States, Roosevelt, weakened by health and by critics demanding focus on the Pacific, faces pressure to scale back European commitments. The specter of a negotiated peace looms in quiet discussions, unthinkable only months earlier. Stalin, isolated and embittered, explores his own contingencies. NKVD archives suggest that channels of communication, never admitted publicly, opened between Soviet officials and German intermediaries in neutral Stockholm. While no formal negotiations take place, the possibility of a separate Soviet-German peace becomes a weapon of suspicion in Allied councils. Roosevelt and Churchill, fearing betrayal, double down on Mediterranean campaigns, hoping to secure a foothold in Europe before Moscow can cut its own deal. The alliance that once defeated Hitler begins to crumble under mistrust and delay. The Cold War, in this alternate timeline, begins not after victory, but during the war itself. The Allies, mistrustful of Soviet resilience, withhold cooperation. Stalin, convinced that the West is deliberately stalling, prepares for post-war confrontation even before Germany is defeated. Intelligence operations expand, with both sides, hoarding secrets and manipulating occupied populations for leverage in the inevitable struggle to follow. The shared cause of defeating fascism dissolves into a tense balancing act of competing agendas. For the soldiers on the ground, the delay in opening the Western Front is not measured in strategy, but in blood. Soviet infantry die in droves along the endless front lines, waiting for relief that never comes. Partisan movements in occupied Europe, deprived of coordinated Allied support, are crushed in waves of reprisals. German forces, emboldened by their resilience, impose harsher rule across the continent, convinced that victory is still within reach. Each month of delay condemns thousands more to death in camps, ghettos, and the burning villages of Eastern Europe. The final victory, when it comes, is slower, darker, and more costly. By the late 1940s, the Allies grind into Central Europe from the south. while Soviet forces, weakened but still unbroken, claw back territory inch by inch. Berlin falls not in May 1945, but years later, amid ruins greater than those we know. The post-war map looks different. Soviet influence weaker, Western presence stronger, the line of division drawn deeper into Eastern Europe's heart. Yet the cost of this altered timeline is counted in millions more dead, in alliances poisoned by mistrust, and in a world where the Cold War begins before the Second World War truly ends. Thus, in this suppressed narrative, the delay of Allied strategy becomes the hinge of history. The failure to deliver a timely second front, born of caution after Stalingrad's fall, reshapes not only the war's course, but the balance of the post-war world. Normandy never becomes the decisive strike. Instead, the Mediterranean grinds into the Balkans, and the dream of unity among the Allies withers in suspicion. The war is won, but at a cost so great that victory itself feels hollow. And in the shadows of history, the delay remains a haunting reminder that wars are not only fought on battlefields, but in councils where hesitation can kill as surely as bullets. Defeat at Stalingrad did not only threaten Soviet armies, it threatened the soul of the Soviet Union itself. In our remembered history, Stalingrad's triumph ignited hope, giving the Red Army and its people the confidence to fight on. But in this alternate account, where Stalingrad falls to the Germans and Paulus's army survives, the Soviet Union faces a different kind of struggle. The battlefield shifts from the Volga's ruins to the forests, swamps, and villages of Eastern Europe. Out of the ashes of defeat, the resistance rises sooner, fiercer, and more desperate. The partisan war begins not in the later years of the conflict, but in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe. From Belarus to Ukraine, Soviet underground networks had already been forming. The NKVD, anticipating the possibility of disaster, had drawn up contingency plans under the codename Operation Spark. These plans envisioned the mobilization of civilians, escaped soldiers, and clandestine cells into a coordinated campaign of sabotage and terror against German occupation. Historically, the program gained momentum after the Red Army's resurgence. In this darker timeline, with the front collapsing after Stalingrad's fall, Moscow has no choice but to unleash it earlier. Soviet propaganda pivots quickly. If the Red Army cannot hold the line, then the people themselves must carry the war into the enemy's rear. The shift is immediate and brutal. By spring 1943, railway lines across Belarus are in flames. German supply trains derail in midnight explosions, their wreckage scattered across frozen fields. Bridges are blown apart, convoys ambushed, officers assassinated in occupied cities. Soviet partisans, once isolated bands, receive coordinated orders through clandestine radio transmissions. Arms are parachuted in by the remnants of the Soviet Air Force, and the NKVD establishes underground networks to channel intelligence back to Moscow. The Germans, shocked by the sudden surge of resistance, respond with the full weight of their repression. Entire villages are burned in reprisal. Civilians are rounded up, deported, executed. But each atrocity feeds the fire rather than extinguishes it. The German High Command, already stretched by the demands of holding vast front lines, finds itself bleeding strength in the rear. Anti-partisan operations, codenamed Operation Cottbus and Operation Hornung, consume divisions that might otherwise reinforce the front. Elite SS units scour forests, but their brutality turns entire regions into hostile territory. Army group centers' supply lines become nightmares of sabotage. Reports from commanders to Berlin describe the countryside as a sea of enemies, invisible by day, merciless by night. The Wehrmacht, designed for sweeping offensives, now finds itself bogged down in a war of shadows it cannot win. For Stalin, the early ignition of partisan war is both salvation and burden. On one hand, it keeps alive the spirit of resistance. Soviet broadcasts celebrate the people's avengers, striking at the occupiers, reminding listeners that the fight is not lost. On the other hand, it reveals the fragility of centralized control. Many partisan groups begin to act independently, driven by local grievances as much as ideology. Ukrainian nationalists, Polish resistance fighters, and Soviet-directed cells all fight the Germans, but not always in harmony. Moscow struggles to coordinate this chaotic insurgency, fearing that a fragmented resistance might one day slip beyond Soviet control. For the Allies, the partisan war becomes both inspiration and concern. Reports smuggled out by OSS operatives describe the destruction of German convoys and the courage of civilians who take up arms. Churchill seizes on these accounts, hailing them as proof that Hitler's grip can be broken from within. But in Washington, strategists note uneasily that the partisan war is also destabilizing, its violence threatening to spiral beyond Soviet command. If the Red Army cannot stabilize the front, will these irregular forces be enough to hold Germany at bay? The question shapes Allied deliberations, deepening their hesitation to commit fully to a second front in France. For Germany, the impact is corrosive. What was envisioned as a swift conquest of Lebensraum turns into a quagmire of insurgency. Hitler, furious at the defiance of conquered peoples, orders harsher reprisals. Einsatzgruppen and SS security divisions escalate their campaigns of terror, turning occupied territories into charnel houses. Yet every massacre breeds new recruits for the resistance. What the Wehrmacht wins in Stalingrad, it loses in the forests of Belarus and Ukraine, where German soldiers march in fear of an enemy they cannot see. The long-term ripple effects reshape the war's trajectory. With the Red Army weakened by the loss at Stalingrad, the partisan war becomes the Soviet Union's primary weapon of attrition. By 1944, instead of massive offensives like Operation Bagration, the Soviets rely on coordinated partisan uprisings to paralyze German logistics before launching limited advances. The effect is slower, bloodier, but still effective. The Germans, unable to secure their rear, see their offensives wither. Even with Stalingrad lost, the war of attrition continues, draining the Reich of men and material it cannot replace. Politically, the early rise of the partisan war deepens post-war tensions. In Poland, underground forces grow stronger, emboldened by early action against the Germans. Their networks, hardened by years of clandestine struggle, later resist Soviet domination as fiercely as they resisted the Reich. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans, already formidable, gain even greater prominence, shaping the post-war Balkans into a uniquely independent sphere. The Soviet Union, though it survives, emerges into the post-war world with less direct control over resistance movements that have tasted independence. The seeds of post-war rebellion against Moscow are sown in these desperate years of early insurgency. 4. The men and women who fought in the shadows. The partisan war is remembered as both triumph and tragedy. Villagers recall the flames of their homes, the price of sheltering fighters, the endless fear of reprisals. Survivors tell of sabotage missions carried out with ancient rifles, stolen grenades, even scythes and axes turned into weapons of resistance. Children remember hunger, smoke, and the sound of trains exploding in the night. For them, the war was not fought on the grand maps of generals, but in the forests, fields, and alleys where they struck and bled and endured. Thus, in this alternate timeline, the fall of Stalingrad does not end Soviet resistance. Instead, it transforms it. The battlefield shifts from cities and steppe to the hidden front, where partisans ignite a war of shadows years earlier than in our reality. The Reich, victorious in one battle, finds itself ensnared in another it cannot win. And the legacy of this early uprising endures beyond the war itself, reshaping not only the outcome of the conflict, but the very contours of the world that follows. The partisan war, born of desperation, becomes the weapon that keeps the Soviet Union alive, and the curse that haunts the occupiers until the very end. In the archives of war, Stalingrad stands as a monument to endurance and sacrifice, a victory carved from ruin. Yet in the shadows of possibility lies another story, where survival becomes prolongation and triumph dissolves into stalemate. A world where the river never turned red with German defeat, and the war stretched into darker years of attrition and suspicion. The battle that shaped the century could just as easily have broken it. And in imagining that path, we confront the most haunting question of all: what if Stalingrad had not saved the world?